Welcome to The Whole View. I'm Stacy Toth of Real Everything. I'm here each week to dive deeper into how we can find happiness and health inside and out through self-love, body positivity, and discovering new ways to be our best selves. Before we get started, a reminder that this podcast is for general educational purposes and is not intended to diagnose, advise, or treat any physical or mental illness. And while Dr. Deming is a medical doctor and oncologist, she's not yours. And we always recommend that you see a licensed health professional accordingly. I said, I do want to welcome you, Katie. She is an MD known as the Conscious Oncologist, a Duke-trained radiation healthcare leader, inventor, and TEDx speaker. Katie blends her knowledge of conventional medicine with holistic practices and ancient wisdom to address the hidden roots of cancer and activate the body's innate capability to heal. She's now committed to addressing the unseen origins of disease, as well as the physical manifestations through a conscious integrative practice with a wholly distinctive approach. And she's been featured in HuffPo, which I often say Huffington Post because I'm that old. For those of you who aren't yet adjusted to the new world, Business Insider, and her own Born to Health podcast. She bridges the gap between Eastern, Western, and ancient systems to reclaim radiant health and well-being, transcending the boundaries of conventional and integrative oncology. She has evolved views and approach to cancer and chronic disease. And science confirms what ancient wisdom shows us, that there's so much more to disease prevention, treatment, and healing than we've been told. And I'm excited to talk about that with you today. I think it's really hard to walk this line between being pro medicine or modern medicine in any way. And yet at the same time, we cannot cure cancer with just positive thoughts, right? And so it's like there's this middle ground between this area where you focus on bringing the best of both and trying to have this holistic approach to wellness. And I'm excited for you to share that with our listeners today. Can you give us a little more insight into what brought you to not holistically walk away from oncology work, right? But still bridge into a little more of that holistic perspective as you approach medicine?
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here with you, Stacy. So I am a traditionally trained radiation oncologist and former healthcare leader. So I practiced radiation oncology and served as a healthcare leader at a very high level. So running end-to-end cancer care for one of the largest healthcare organizations in the US. And in 2020, I had an experience that is similar to a near-death experience, but it's actually called a shared death experience. And I didn't even know what this was before it happened to me, but it's not common. But when it happens, it most commonly happens to doctors, nurses, emergency personnel who are at the scene where someone else dies. And those people have a metaphysical experience similar to a near-death experience, and it can be life-changing. And that's what happened to me in the fall of 2020. And it actually happened right on the heels of being nominated for a very high position. So I just spent like the past 5 months before this event interviewing for the national medical director of all of cancer care for one of the largest healthcare organizations in the US. And it had come down to me and another woman. And ultimately, the other woman got the position. And I was like, this is happening for a reason. And then about a week later, this event happened to me. And basically what happened was there was a woman who was dying of breast cancer, which was my specialty. And I experienced the light, the love, the whole experience people describe with the near-death experience as she transitioned. And it fundamentally shifted the way I saw everything. And specifically, that I saw we were missing big pieces of the puzzle in Western medicine. And I understand Western oncology really well from end to end, from screening and prevention all the way through survivorship after treatment or into end of life because of the roles that I've played as a healthcare leader. And so this really shifted my perspective. And I knew that I needed to leave the system to do something different. But exactly as you say, I do think there's a place for Western medicine and even Western oncology. But I think there's a lot of things that we're missing. And what, for me, the biggest thing was I wasn't taught a lot of the things that contribute to us becoming sick in 2024. And if we don't address those issues that are making us sick, we can have the best treatments, precision-guided medicine, all of these advanced technologies, but if we're going after the wrong targets for what's underlying the cancer, then we're basically missing the boat. And this was what I had sensed before this event happened. Back in, I think it was like 2017, I was at a meditation retreat, and the leader was telling this story about, was a parable of a river. And it was talking about, there was a village that was, situated along a river. And one day in that river, the villagers saw a body, a person floating. And they were like, someone's drowning. And they rushed out and they saved the person. And so they brought the person to dry land, got that person safe. And then the next day there were 2 people drowning in the river. So then they sent 2 people out. And then the next day there were 4. And pretty soon this village had gotten very organized because the number of people who were drowning in the river was doubling every day. And they became very skilled at rescuing people off the river. They had these elaborate boat systems and rescue pulleys and all of these things. And the village elders were praising the villagers on what an amazing job they were doing. And I looked at my friend. I was at this retreat with another colleague who was a GYN oncologist. And I looked at her and I said, this is Western oncology. And what the heck is happening up the river? And also, by the way, we are the glorified rescue workers on the river. And when we get them onto dry land, we don't really know why they fell in the first place. So then we're not helping them get well. And that opened my eyes to this idea of like, there's something going on upstream of them getting to me that we don't understand, because more and more people are falling in the river. More young people are falling in the river. And that's actually increased tremendously since that was 2017. And now in 2024, we're seeing that in the statistics. It's really rising, the number of young people getting cancer. And if we don't understand the problem, even if we kill the cancer, are we really fixing what the issue is? So this is now what I'm focused on, is really uncovering what are the hidden roots. Like, why is someone really sick? And it's not just one thing. There are lots of things in our modern lifestyle that are making us sick, that if you're not aware of them, it's easy to end up in those statistics. And the statistics today are quite frightening for cancer, because in the US, 1 in 2 men will get cancer in their lifetime and 1 in 3 women. And by 2040, it's projected that it'll be 1 in 2 men and women.
Wow. I think the analogy of the river is one that I appreciate a lot, because I think it makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that you said was, if we're not aware of these things, then we can't fix them. And I think a lot of my listeners are very smart and very aware. And one of the things that's hard is that we know that we can't always avoid all of these things. Like, there are exposures everywhere we are, but we can do the best that we can with what knowledge we have. And also, I want to start the show with this acknowledgement that if someone does get sick, it is not a blame game of like, could have, should have, would have done differently, in terms of looking back and having guilt or shame or any of those kinds of things to whatever an exposure might have been. And that if we can begin to look up the river a little bit and say, can we help future generations learn how to keep people out of the water a little bit? Or can we regulate that bridge that people are falling off of, right? Like, I'm big in terms of like government regulation needing to have more of an impact on health protective laws and resources for humans, because to me, allowing companies to dump toxic chemicals and do all these kinds of things isn't helping our cause either. So before we get into all of that, though, I think it would be good to baseline just even cancer from a very simple perspective, because I think culturally, the word cancer in and of itself creates anxiety, which is also not good for our health. And a lot of people don't fully understand what is cancer, what does treatment look like, various diagnoses, and what that truly means in terms of an unwelcome intruder violating our sacred space, our body, right? Like, no matter what, it feels very overwhelming. And so I'd love if you could help put some perspective on how we can maybe think about this from a place of being empowered instead of being fearful, and just give a little bit of like baseline education before we jump into some of the other things about the work that you do.
Sure. So I think this idea of cancer as an invader and an intruder is a story that has been perpetuated, but I actually don't think that's what cancer is. And actually, I talk about this in my TEDx talk, how to talk to someone with cancer. And that cancer is, rather than something that's invading you, it's a it's your body talking to you. Your body is saying something's out of balance. We are designed to be in balance with our bodies. And when things get really out of balance, cancer is one of the manifestations of that. And so for me, I think it's really important, actually. I'm glad that you brought this up, because the way that we think about anything that we go through, including a medical illness like cancer, really impacts the way that we approach it and also the way that we can heal it. And so I think when you think about cancer as just a sign, just information that things are out of balance in your body, and that it's not like you need to attack the cancer, because the cancer is part of you, right? So when we're attacking the cancer, we're attacking ourselves. And actually, one of the things that I think is really important, which you talk a lot about, is self-love, and actually being able to love and trust your body, even when something like cancer has shown itself in the body. And that's actually one of the biggest things that I see, is people get very fearful of their body, and that their body has failed them when they get a diagnosis like cancer. So that's the first thing that I would say, is that I really think this idea of the enemy and fighting and battling something inside you is a problematic narrative that was honestly perpetuated by politicians, the war on cancer, or companies that are making money, or nonprofits that are using this language to raise money. But the truth is that when you're talking to someone who is going through an experience like this, using this battle language can be very problematic for people, because it puts them in a fight or flight state, and then also not trusting themselves. So unraveling that is a little bit more complicated, though, just because of the world that we live in, right? And all of that language is just everywhere when we're talking about cancer. But for me, what I do is I really want people to understand your body hasn't failed you. The fact that this has presented itself is your body's way of saying, hey, you need to pay attention to me. I need something I'm not getting. And it opens a dialogue for how do you figure out what your body is asking you for. And you said something also important in there, is that we cannot change our environment completely. We can make good decisions. We can change certain things about our environment, but there are certain things that are just present. And so it's not about being afraid of the environment that you live in either, because that's problematic. It's learning how to resource yourself by nourishing the body with what it needs, from food to supplements to the right movement to the right physical practices, emotional, mental, and spiritual, and then also detoxifying the stuff that is in our environment that is just continues to come at us. We have to constantly be finding a balance between detoxifying the things that don't belong and then nourishing ourselves with the things that we need to thrive.
It's interesting. You just defined what I call non-toxic living inside and out, because to me, that means not just the things we're putting on our body or in our body, but also the thoughts that we have and the impact that it has on our overall well-being, and whether it leads to disease in the body or it leads to mental health, which can also affect us negatively from a full spectrum of problematic physical things that manifest from that. It is interesting how much of the modern wellness culture avoids that aspect. And you mentioned this political perspective of the war on cancer. And as you were talking, I could totally see like where someone would have come from that kind of marketing perspective in the aim to be helpful to people without the realization that it is putting someone in a fight or flight kind of response. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I think where I struggle is that when someone is in the midst of these incredibly difficult life challenges, whether it's yourself or it's a loved one, you look to experts, and I'll use quotation marks when I say that, because there's a lot of people who are sharing information without the qualifications, the education, the experience to do so. And they're coming from a place of like, N equals one, or this is my experience. And I think that's also where this idea of kind of a marketing war on cancer comes from, right? And it's like, how do we incorporate, as you say, this conscious medicine perspective where we can support our loved ones or support ourselves with the things that are really helpful and healing, whether it be cleaning out things in our house that might be physically toxic or cleaning out the relationships in our lives that might be emotionally toxic, right? Like, how do we support those kinds of things while also allowing space for some of the also problematic and toxic things like radiation and the things that are in contrast to that, right? Like, how do we create harmony, this balance in our body that you speak to, while also, I don't know, is there a yin yang approach, or is it just this constant battle that you're like then saying to yourself, it's not a battle, it's balance? You know what I'm like? How do you work with people or the stories of the folks that you speak with, all of these kinds of things? That seems like a really difficult balance for people to find, is I guess what I'm trying to express.
Yeah, they are counter to each other. So this is part of why I left the traditional system, even though I see the place for it. I've become more of a bridge between these two worlds, because you're absolutely right. You're fighting toxicity, right? If toxicity in our world, whether that's environmental, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, is the cause of this illness, then why would we give treatments that we know are toxic? So we know radiation is toxic to the body. We know that chemotherapy is toxic. Why would we give more toxicity? And this is actually one of the very important points that I explain to people. And this is one of the things that you need to know about cancer. Everybody needs to know about cancer, but nobody is telling you, is that the treatments, chemotherapy and radiation, they have a place, but they are going to increase toxicity in your body. And so if you choose to do these treatments, you have to understand that they are going to increase toxicity in the body. And then also they are going to lower your immune function. And cancer actually is already an imbalance of those things. You got too much toxicity in the body, and then the body is not fighting that cancer appropriately, because normally our immune system takes care of cancer cells. It's normal for us to have cancer cells in our body, and our body just takes care of it, right? But when it gets out of balance and you have too much toxicity and lowered immune function, that's when cancer presents itself. So these treatments that we're doing, you have to know that when you finish those treatments, that you want to detoxify your body and you want to do things to help build up your immune system. And this is a lot of the work that I do. And also another piece of that's important for people to know is that chemotherapy and radiation kill cancer cells in a logarithmic fashion, which is similar to antibacterial. So I'm sure everyone has seen an antibacterial bottle that it says on the bottle, kills 99.99% of bacteria. Never says kill 100%. That's because it uses logarithmic kill to kill the bacteria. Well, cancer treatments rather are the same way. So they kill the cancer cells via logarithmic fashion. And so you're going to have a sharp decrease in those cancer cells, but you're not going to get rid of every last cancer cell. But all radiation oncologists and medical oncologists are taught, well, it's okay that we don't kill every last cancer cell because the immune system can take care of small amounts of cancer, right? But when we know the problem, it's already out of balance, how is now a further weakened immune system going to take care of cancer cells if it didn't do it before you gave these treatments? And so these are two things that I think are really important, is understanding that cancer is really this imbalance of increased toxicity, lower immune function, and then the way the treatments work, you actually now are going to rely on the immune system to take care of any cancer cells that are left behind. But if you don't do anything to help your body clear out after all these treatments, your body may not be able to do what it's supposed to do. And I think this is why recurrence rates are high, is because we're not really helping the body then do what it needs to do once these treatments are done.
Of the issue, so to speak, whether it's both from an exposure perspective of something going on in an environment, or like if someone is living somewhere where they're exposed to something over and over again, obviously that's going to create recurrence. And on the same token, if you're exposing yourself to relationships that are stressing your body out and doing all these kinds of things and not removing yourself from that situation, it is creating that same situation for recurrence to happen. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about this idea of exposure because, well, first of all, while you were talking, I was like, there is such a market need for a professional licensed person to do cancer coaching, not just like grief counseling type coaching, but like, are there people that can, from like a therapeutic perspective, focus on helping people identify toxins in their life from an emotional, mental health perspective and inform people to get to that healthier place post treatment or even during treatment, right? Because I think also the resting and the recovering during treatment is really important. And I know people in my life who I see a difference in the people who really rest and recover and how their body supports them, if that makes sense, versus people who are trying to push through and continue to live their life as it was during treatment and how their body then makes them rest. Like it seems like people get more sick and those kinds of things. And it reminds me of like when you get a cold or a flu and you don't rest, then you're going to get the cold, the flu so much worse, right? Because your body's like, no, really, you need to rest right now. And that's that immune function that you're talking about, I imagine.
Absolutely. Well, what you're just describing is what I do. So this is my current practice, is that I help people look at their life in a holistic way and figure out what needs to change and how to resource themselves so that they become resilient to, if there are toxins. There are some things in our environment that we're not going to get away from. We're not going to get away from Wi-Fi. We're not going to get away from glyphosate that's in all the soil, even if you're eating organic food. So there's certain things that we are going to live with a certain amount of toxicity. And so you figure out, okay, what are the ways that you can protect someone from those things without having to fully eliminate them from their environment. But then there are a lot of things that we can change. And actually, this is what I tell my clients, is that change is required. You cannot do the same things that you did before this diagnosis and expect to get a different result. So, and this is coming from a woman. So I am probably like I understand this problem. Like you think, I can do hard things. I can do everything. I can like whatever. I had a baby and went back to work 7 days later because my residency, like something had changed about the rules and I was supposed to have a maternity leave. And then all of a sudden they said, you can't have it. Instead of me just saying, screw that, I'm not doing that. I'm going to have a baby and I'm going to take time off and then I'll come back. I went back to work after a week. That's like ridiculous. And so these women who want to work through their chemotherapy, they want to keep pushing. I get you. I am you. Like, understand. But the truth is that what you said, Stacy, is absolutely correct, is that you're going to do better if you get off the merry-go-round. Like, all of us are on this merry-go-round of life. We're just going around and it's going faster and faster. This is part of why we're getting sicker, is because the stress levels are higher. We're doing more. We've been conditioned to think it's normal to be doing 1,000 things all the time. And you need to get off that merry-go-round. If you have cancer, the first thing that I would tell you is that you need to stop. Yes, your doctor may say you could work through chemotherapy. I'm going to tell you, you're going to do better if you slow down. And of course, I'm not giving medical advice, but this is a general basic thing. This is the first thing that I would say to people is figure out, how can you create more space? How can you slow your life down so that you can look at what's happening? And that it's really important. And I do think that there are things that you can do during treatment. The reason why I focus on afterwards is because in my practice, I support a lot of people who are going through conventional therapy, like radiation and chemotherapy, and doing supplements, and we're changing their diet, and we do some fasting, and we do things to help them protect themselves as best as possible from those treatments. But I see it almost, I don't want to say impossible, but it is very challenging to do the things that are necessary to balance your body when you're going through that treatment. So more than anything, what we're doing is we're buffering against the effects to minimize them so that the damage is less of that toxicity. But you're absolutely right that you have to change your life. And I think this idea that, sometimes when you start talking about these things, like the emotional roots of cancer, people get like, oh, well, I've got cancer and now you're saying it's my fault. And like, that's the furthest thing. Like, I will tell you, that is not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that it's actually empowering to think that you have some control over what's happening. Western medicine, the way that I was taught is that, oh, it's genetic. But then, by the way, genetics only account for 5 to 10% of most cancers. So I specialized in breast and gynecologic cancers, and breast cancer, the genetic mutations only count for 5 to 10% of the cases. And then 90% of the time I was saying to people like, I don't know, it's just bad luck. Well, that is not empowering at all to just think it's like bad luck. And half the population doesn't have bad luck to be getting cancer, right? So it's like, this for me is like, no, actually, I don't think that it's your fault, like that you intentionally caused this, but you're living in a society that is dangerous. Like, the modern industrialized life is not good for our health. And if you can understand that and you can start to see the places where, wow, this is eroding my health, and start to make changes, you can change that story. And so I think it's one of empowerment from my standpoint, but you have to get over that initial thing like, is it my fault? No, it's not your fault. And it is your responsibility if you want to get well, to make the changes.
It makes a lot of sense from the perspective of our cells turning over and healing themselves while we sleep. That if we're not slowing down and allowing ourselves to rest and to get more sleep and to do these kind of restorative activities during and after treatment, but also in life in general, to have some of that prevention that you were talking about and allowing our bodies to do the work beforehand, that we would be causing an increase in the incident. So I'm curious if the statistics are such. I would have thought about this and looked it up beforehand, so I don't have a study in front of me to say, but I'm assuming that in other areas of the world where people live, let's say Spain, right? Spain is still an industrialized country, but they have a much more dedicated commitment to an afternoon siesta and a kind of more enjoying living a life of color and liveliness. I think of when I go to Spain that people are just more joyful and relaxed and those sort of things. Do we see a lower incidence of cancer in not just rural areas, right? Where we know that the exposure is less, but also in areas where people are living a slower pace type life?
Yeah, so I don't know the answer to that specific question because there's a lot of nuances that you would have to tease out in those studies to understand exactly what it is that is different, right, between that group of people and then like the standard American living. But I'll give you an example that does tie to what you're saying, and that is the work of Weston A. Price. So Weston A. Price was a dentist who in the 1930s traveled all around the world to study primitive or indigenous people. And really, he was initially interested in their dental health and their facial structure because he was thinking that there's something going on with modern industrialized lifestyle that's shifting the way that people's mouths are shaped and also dental disease. But what he found was that in these societies that were completely isolated from Western ways of living, so more fast-paced, introducing some processed food. And in the 30s, obviously, it was different than now we're 100 years later. But basically what he found was these people had perfect dental structure, never had cavities, did not have cancer, did not have tuberculosis, which was the disease of that time, and also did not have depression. They were very healthy. And that once you started to introduce Western lifestyle with the way that we eat, the way that we live, doing more, all of that stuff, basically they started to see the same diseases that we have in modern society. And I think that is like a good example of showing that people who are living in this way, a more natural way to be living in their environment and living with the cues of the sun, right? They were not staying up late at night on their computers. They're going to bed when the sun goes down and then waking up when the sun comes up. And yeah, they're doing work to take care of themselves, but it's not the fast-paced lifestyle that we're living. They didn't have cancer. We didn't see cancer in those groups of people. So I think that's a good example of looking at the Western lifestyle. But there are a lot of things that come in there, right? It's not just the pace of the lifestyle. It's also the way we eat and a lot of the other pressures that come in.
Yeah, I think I have, in a previous life of my own, done a ton of kind of work and understanding as it relates to those kinds of things. And so to me, my question was less around because those individuals would have had less exposure as well to the modern toxins and all the kinds of things beyond just circadian rhythms and resting and those sort of things. But I was thinking more just the pace at which modern society believes that we need to constantly be doing more. And I think that I've talked a lot about on the show about this idea of productivity adding value to who we are morally and how that's a flawed belief put upon us by the people who want us to do more work. And so I was thinking, okay, what's a country that is living kind of exposures, but really approaches something from a different mindset? And interestingly, I just went to like countries by cancer rate Wikipedia page. So of course, take this for what it's worth, but looking at person per capita, not just like how many people are in the population, when it's balanced out, America was actually lower than I thought it was going to be. The States were number 5, but Spain is 29 out of 49. And I was like, yep, that's what I was expecting to see. Like they're way far down on the list in terms of much more countries who would be comparatively less modernized, yet Spain is very modern, but they have a much different approach to the way that they live life. So that's just my own personal like fascination and interest on, because I do think that my own health took an incredible change when I started understanding my true stress triggers, right? Like when I was convincing myself that stress was something different than what I was experiencing when I had a high stressed, high paced corporate job, while also having a side hustle, while also having a second side hustle, while also raising at the time 3 kids, right? Like, and I was telling myself that I was living this balanced life because I was doing some of the practices of Weston A. Price and I was doing avoidance of plastics and these other things. And I was like, it's fine. I'm fine. Everything's fine. And then as soon as I actually addressed the stress in my life, I was like, wow, I can feel the difference in my nervous system. Like I can actually feel the inflammation being less in my body because everything was so tight and so stressed. And I don't think that enough, specifically Americans, are in touch enough with our bodies and our minds that way because we are on that wheel, right? Like, because it felt to me like at the time that I had to be doing all the things that I was doing, but really, it took a lot of courage and it took a lot of work in other areas of my life to make that happen. But getting off of that wheel was life changing for not just my mental health, but my physical health as well.
Yeah, 100%. Well, and I think it's not one thing, it's all the things. And the pace and stress of our modern life is a big contributor to the problems with our health and the stress on our bodies. And I just want to come back to that one thing with Spain. So you have to remember too, in Europe, they have much higher strict guidelines too about environmental toxins. So this is where it gets so nuanced that you can't just talk about one country without isolating stress. But what you're saying is absolutely true, that the stress and the pace of modern lifestyle is one of the big contributors. But I think this is one of the things that I always want people to understand. It wasn't one thing that caused cancer or any other illness that's like a modern illness. It's usually a convergence of multiple things that are coming together. And also, when you're running 1,000 miles an hour, you're not sleeping well, you're doing more than your body can handle, you lose the reserve of the healing potential in the body and it stresses the immune system. So it makes sense, right? Makes sense that this would make us sick, that this would be a contributor to us feeling bad in our body, even if you were eating all the right foods. And this is actually one of the things that I have a lot of people come to me who they were eating raw vegan, they were running marathons, they were like, they're like, I am the picture of health. And I'm like, are you?
That's
Like,
part of the problem is this definition of perfect and putting themselves in that box. Yeah.
yeah. So, but it's like, it's one of those things where it's like, what is the energy and intention with which you're doing these things? Because I find that some people are doing these things around diet or whatever in a really constricted way out of fear, right? Of fear of their body, like they want to look a certain way, or fear of cancer. Even that, like someone who's eating a diet that they think is going to prevent cancer, but they're doing it out of fear of cancer, that is stress on your body, right? So it's all these things. It's not just the things that we do, it's the way that we're doing them and the way that we're being. And we're not human doers, we're human beings, right? So like we're here to be, and we don't need to do anything to be worthy of love and living a beautiful life. But we've been sold a story that is counter to that. And I think it's just conditioning, right? And what you described beautifully is you've undone a lot of that conditioning. The work that you've done, it takes courage to step outside and be like, you know what, this narrative that everyone's doing, it doesn't fit for me. And so I need to listen to myself and do what feels right for me. And that's the other thing too, is that everyone's healing is different because you need to heal something different than someone else. And all of us have our own demons or like struggles. Like I've got my own things that are challenges for me and they're different than someone else's. And so it's how do you be compassionate with yourself to look at those things face on and be really honest with, okay, this is what I'm challenged by. And how do I shift that with love and compassion and do it because I love myself rather than I'm trying to be this perfect mold of whatever it is or be the healthiest. Like all of those things, you can be doing the right things, but if the intention behind it is from a scarcity, lack perspective, not loving yourself, trying to be something that you're not, trying to fit into someone else's mold, that can harm you.
It's interesting to think about all the things that can harm us. And I know I just like randomly brought up this wiki page. And as we're thinking about, okay, Europe has more stricter rules about certain things. But what's interesting is the top 15, most of them are from Europe, like Germany, United Kingdom, France, Canada, whether we're counting that as European or not. So I'm looking at Ireland is number 3. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, let's think about this constant exposure that we have. So that's why I said I was surprised that United States was 5 because of the complete lack of regulation that we have around so much exposure to carcinogens and toxins. I recently did the show on the EPA regulation finally addressing the PFAS in our water and acknowledging that it is killing people and that we need to make a change, right? So from the air that we breathe that's polluted to the water that we drink that has microplastics and PFAS and all of the things, everything we touch, everything we eat, like there seems to be never ending information about different things that are of concern. So if we're talking about kind of Weston A. Price studies, right? Like, or even beyond that, there's so many studies that look at traditional tribal cultures and the low rate of disease and the blue zones that we're able to see where people live for a really long time, right? Like a lot of these things have in common a number of things, not just the fact that they're more joyful, gratitude, compassionate type people, which is great. That's what those studies highlight. It also finds that there is a lower incidence of toxic exposure in these areas. Where do we draw the line individually on what is important enough to mitigate from our lives, not just the emotional, mental health things that we can let go, but also these actual physical exposures that we might have in our lives so that we can sleep at night knowing I've done the best that I can. And I might still have, in my case, in my house, hexachromium at a higher rate than I want. And like I say that all the time because it's like the Aaron Brockovich movie. I'm like, really? Even after a movie, we can't remove that from our water in an affluent county? But it is, it's there, right? And so it's like I can do as much as I can and have a water filter on my shower and a water filter at my sink, but there's still a ton of other places that, there's water in my house where we're getting exposure to these. And do I move? Do I like where, as someone who's in this work, do you advise people to either think for themselves, where do you draw the line, or like, how do you go about that?
Well, I start with just saying progress over perfection. And I'm in that process myself. So all of this is new. What's interesting is in Western oncology, we're not taught any of these things about the toxins in our environment and reducing this. So my environmental toxins were very high when I actually left. And I've spent the past couple of years shifting the products that I use, changing the water filtration system that I use, so doing all the things. But let's talk about epigenetics. So even if you had a mutation that predisposes you to cancer, not everyone develops cancer, right? And actually, you can think of someone who smokes and drinks and abuses their bodies their whole life and they live till they're 90, right? And then also actually going back to the Weston A. Price data, some of those people actually had very high exposure to toxic smoke because they lived in cold places and they're in these little teepees filled with smoke and they didn't get cancer. So it's not just the exposure to the toxin or having a genetic mutation. It's actually how we are living and being and thinking about those things as well. And The Biology of Belief by Bruce Lipton is a great book to read about this. So Bruce Lipton is a cell biologist who really initially did the studies with stem cells. And what he realized was that the culture that you put the cells in is what determined what they turned into, the environment, right? So the environment that the cells were in ultimately determined the end result of those cells. And so he went on to do studies of looking at, well, for us as human beings, the environment of what we are is heavily influenced by our mind and what we're thinking. And so our mind and the way we interpret our environment plays a role in the development of illness or not, expression of the genes. And so the way we think about things matters maybe even more than the exposure itself. And so for me, I'm always balancing doing the best that I can and also just not worrying about it. Like, I'm not going to worry about it because I know that the worrying about it is more problematic than the toxic substance itself. And also, like, I'll just take, for example, like, most of the time I eat well, but on Sunday, I was like, I want to have an ice cream. And I had an ice cream, and then I don't beat myself up about it. You know what I'm saying? It's like the things that we do, the way we think about it also impacts the way that our body responds to it. And so with the household stuff and because this is actually one of the things that I do a lot of coaching on with people, because people with cancer all of a sudden are very aware of all the toxins around them. And then they can become paralyzed by that fear because you can't get rid of all of it, right? And if you wanted to move away from this, you'd have to go to another planet, right? So we've got all of this coming at us. And the truth is, not everybody's getting cancer, right? A high proportion, but it's like we can do the best that we can, but then also use our minds in a very powerful way to say, I'm going to do the best that I can, and then I'm going to let it go. And actually, Anita Moorjani is a very powerful story of this. So Anita Moorjani is a woman who has a book. She has multiple books, but her first book was called Dying to Be Me. And in that book, she described she was paranoid about cancer. So her best friend had developed cancer and her brother-in-law. And so she was terrified of cancer. So she was eating a raw vegan diet. She was doing all the things, like everything. She eliminated all toxins in her environment. Ultimately, she developed a lymphoma. And then the lymphoma progressed to the point where she went into a coma and was full of these tumors, and her organs were going into failure. She was going into kidney failure and basically was dying. She had a near-death experience. And during her near-death experience, she saw that her fear of all of these things that could cause cancer was ultimately the cause of her cancer. And she knew that if those beliefs had led to her cancer, then shifting those could also heal her. And she came back. She did not die. She came back into her body. All of the tumors melted away, and she walked out of that hospital, and now she teaches people how to heal. And this is an example of someone who she will describe that it was the fear itself. She was doing all the right things, but she was so fearful of her environment of getting cancer that ultimately overrode her biology and led her develop cancer in her body. And then the simple realization of acknowledging that melted it all away. And that's a very extreme but profound example of how what we think about our environment matters.
It reminds me also of the phenomenon that people who go through IVF and then have a baby through IVF, there is a higher incidence of having a pregnancy without IVF after. And it's like the fear is able to let go. And you can't tell someone it's absolutely nobody's fault or any blame anywhere. You can't tell someone, oh, just stop stressing and you'll have a baby. Like, that's not the reality either. But it is this absolute when we hold on to things so tightly within our bodies are then following our lead. It is partially woo, but it's also incredibly backed by science that stress is one of the worst absolute things that we can do to our body. And so whether we're stressing about a fear of cancer or all of these other areas of our life, it can lead to more problematic things. And as someone with an autoimmune disease, multiple autoimmune disease, the joke for me is always like, no one can kick my butt as well as I can, right? Like, and part of that is holding on to the control, holding on, all of these kinds of things, because a lot of people who have autoimmune disease overlap with this type A personality. And it's like we are doing it to ourselves in cannot blame ourselves, all of these kinds of things, but at the same time, we have to learn how to remap our habits, our neural pathways, our all of these kinds of things to say, I can't control that as much as I want to in life. Like, I can't control it. So I need to let go and accept in what is. And I know from my personal experience that that is a difficult thing. So I can only imagine how difficult it is as it relates to fertility and cancer and all of these other places where we see this overlap of needing to change our mental and emotional health as much as we're changing our physical health, and whether it's exposures or all of the other lifestyle things that can play into that. I wanted to dive into more of the logistics in terms of exposures, but I will point listeners to our show notes on prior shows of talking about personal care products, talking about nonstick pans, talking about some of the other deep dives that we've done that have been linked to increase of cancer risk. And also, we did a dedicated show on the paraben cancer prevention study, which I hope that you're excited about that, Katie, in the study where when people stopped having exposure to parabens, that their cells actually like regenerated in a way, not just overcoming cancer, but in no longer having the same risk identified for having cancer recurrence, right? Like this idea of reducing your tox exposure with this paraben study opens up the world and all of us to the idea that the changes that we're making can have significant impact on ourselves and also, especially if we're women, future generations and the epigenetics and all the things that we're passing on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that it just speaks to the fact that our bodies are remarkable and resilient. And it reminds me of the smoking data. So, smoking data shows the same thing. If you stop smoking, you can reverse those effects. And so the same thing when you remove the toxins, and this is beautiful. So we're like, okay, well, once we identify it, if we do better, we're lowering our risk and our bodies are going to recover and they can get back to what they were before. Our bodies are designed to heal, right? So like I love to take the example of like you cut your finger, it heals on its own. We don't even think about that, right? Everyone knows that. But a diabetic cuts their finger and it doesn't heal, right? Because there's too much sugar in the bloodstream and that sugar is impeding the healing. The same thing is happening in our body with a bunch of other things, like so parabens or different toxins, the emotional toxins, whatever they are that we're talking about, these things in our body are affecting our ability to heal. But the body's natural response is to heal. And so this is the work that I do with people is like, let's get rid of the things that are making you sick and just get out of the way. Like we actually don't need to do a lot to the body to heal other than recognize what is making us sick and then start to eliminate those things as best we can and then building ourselves up so that we are getting the right nourishment that we need. But then the body just does what it's designed to do, which is heal beautifully.
Can you remind listeners where they can continue to follow your work and learn more?
Sure. So my website is katiedeming.com, and my podcast is called Born to Heal.
And you have some workshops and free guides and different kinds of things on your website. We will link those in the show notes for you listeners, as well as some studies and different references of things that we've mentioned here on the show. Katie, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and for the work that you're doing to help people heal and live whole, vibrant lives. Vibrant, that's the word I was looking for earlier, referring to Spain, but vibrant lives in general. And I want to thank you, listeners, as always, for your willingness to be open to grow through your own personal change. I know sometimes hearing statistics around cancer can feel really scary, and you think about all the people that you love in your life and how fearful it might be for them to be sick, for you to be sick. And hopefully the work that Katie is doing can inspire us all to come from a place of empowerment and wholeness and those kinds of thoughts, instead of from this fear-based place where I know it's my instinct to go as well. So thank you for your willingness to listen to all of that, because no one is perfect. All of us, we're all learning, listening, learning, and unlearning. We can choose to become better versions of ourselves for ourselves. Katie, thank you so much. Is there anything else that we forgot to mention that you want to tell listeners before we head out?
No, I think the one thing is that what you're teaching here is really empowering. And I see the story that we have the power to change the story as it's being written right now. And whether that's through changing policy to put protection in place, but each of us individually, as we become more aware, you don't have to become one of the statistics. And if you have someone who's sick, you can share with them some of the things that you're learning so that they can incorporate that. This is not the stuff that's being taught in the schools. This is not the stuff that you're going to hear from your doctor, but these are things that can change the narrative. We have the potential, and it's with each one of us through compassion and self-love, not through any like you've done something wrong. It's like, okay, we don't like the statistics of where we're going as a whole population. So just making tiny changes, progress over perfection, and just make those little changes and be gentle with yourself, and you're on your way already to a new history.
I love it. Thank you so much. And thank you, listeners. And we'll be back again next week.